In the 1990s, a secret cult known as the Samaritan Foundation was operating in the city of Guthrie, Oklahoma. The leader of this cult was a woman named Linda Green. Linda conducted ancient rituals and preached about demonic possessions, vampires, aliens, and even zombies. And using her natural charm and mesmerizing sermons, she managed to drag her followers down with her in her descent into madness. And one of those followers was a man named Alan Ross. Alan, who was once a well-respected member of the Chicago film community, joined Linda's cult and quickly fell under her spell. And then in 1995, Alan suddenly vanished without a trace. Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Summer Sanchez, and on this channel we talk about crime cults and heinous history. So if that sounds interesting to you, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications. Today we're talking about the Samaritan Foundation cult and the bizarre disappearance of Alan Ross. But before we get into the case, let's briefly talk about today's sponsor. This video is sponsored by Trade. You guys already know how much I love Trade. I talk about them all the time on this channel. Trade delivers the freshest coffees right to your doorstep. And these coffees are different from the ones you buy from the grocery store. They're sourced from small roasters from all over the country from brands you've probably never heard of. Trade offers over 450 different types of coffees, and they're all roasted to order and shipped out within 48 hours. This one is called Cuvée, and as you can see on the tag here, the coffee was brewed on November 21st, and I received this one on November 23rd. So as always, it arrived super fresh. I've had the pleasure of trying out tons of different coffees from brands that I never would have been able to try out if it hadn't been for my Trade subscription. And it doesn't matter what type of coffee you prefer or how you make it, Trade has something for everyone. And the holidays are coming up, and a Trade subscription would be the perfect gift for any coffee lover. You can choose between 3, 6, or 12-month gift subscriptions, and the gift recipient will receive a new coffee every month tailored to their taste and roasted to order. And you don't have to know anything about the person's coffee taste or their brew preferences. You just need to know their email address and when you want their gift to hit their inbox. It's really easy to set up. You don't have to go out shopping for a gift. You just set everything up online and Trade takes care of the rest. I know I would love to receive something like that. So give your loved ones the gift of great coffee this year by going to drinktrade.com/summer or clicking the link in the description box. A huge thank you to Trade for the continued support on this channel, and now let's get into the case. Linda Lee Green was a leader of a bizarre cult formed in the 1980s called the Samaritan Foundation, and to be honest, we know little to nothing about her early life. I couldn't find any information about Linda's childhood or really anything about her early life in general. I think that she was born in 1951 just based on this memorial page that I found online. The death dates match up. So we're just going to jump ahead to the early 80s when Linda would have been in her early 30s. At this point, Linda is a registered nurse and she's the director of the very first hospice in Oklahoma. She would make house calls to terminally ill patients and she would administer various drugs like sedatives and pain medications just to keep them comfortable in their final days. And in the beginning, Linda had a great reputation. She was very well thought of by her coworkers and her patients. She was very caring and sensitive. You know, the whole point of hospice is to ensure that people are as comfortable and pain-free as possible in their final days, and Linda was the person who provided that comfort. She became like one of the family because she would be a near constant presence leading up to the death of her patients. I found news articles dating back to 1983 all about Linda and how amazing she was at her job and how much peace and comfort she brought into the families of those terminally ill patients. Linda appeared on news segments about her position at the hospital. She even wrote poetry about her job as a hospice nurse. The family members of her patients started referring to Linda as the angel of death, but like in a good way. That was supposed to be a term of endearment. And all of this is very ironic considering what Linda turns into and what she goes on to do. Seeing Linda in the hospice ad and, just reading about how loved she was by everyone and how she was seen as this really caring, amazing person, it's hard to understand where it all went wrong because Linda is about to do a complete 180 and she will go on to form a very bizarre cult not long after that news segment first aired. Now, Linda's personal life was not nearly as stable as her professional life, and she would have a string of failed marriages by the time she was in her early 30s. By this point, Linda had already been married and divorced 4 times, and it was during her time at the hospice facility that Linda meets husband number 5, a man named Dennis Green. Dennis was working for the Catholic Church as like a consultant for fundraising and nonprofits, and he was also a volunteer at the same hospital where Linda was working at the time. They met, started dating, fell in love, and they got married in 1984. And they had their one and only child in 1985. They had a son named Daniel. And it was around this time that Dennis and Linda's lives take a very bizarre turn. It all started when Linda left her position at the hospital under suspicious circumstances. It's not fully known how it all went down, but it had something to do with missing narcotics. When a hospice patient passes away, the narcotics that they were prescribed, they're supposed to be disposed of by like a medical professional, like a registered nurse. And a witness is typically present during the disposal as well. This is done to reduce the likelihood of a family member or even one of the medical staff pocketing the drugs after a patient dies. I know police officers can be called in to witness the disposal of the narcotics. I'm not sure if this is the norm, but I've personally seen this happen. But apparently there was some suspicious activity involving Linda and some narcotics that were supposed to have been disposed of, and she ended up leaving her job because of this, and she left under a cloud of suspicion. So could drugs have had anything to do with the downward spiral that Linda is about to experience? Could she have been secretly addicted to the same narcotics that she had been administering to her patients, and her addiction led to this massive shift in personality? I don't know. But what I do know is that after she lost her job, Linda became very interested in New Age practices and ancient rituals. And one of these rituals was dowsing. Dowsing is an ancient practice that can be traced back all the way to the Middle Ages. People would use divining rods in order to locate underground water sources, and these divining rods would supposedly vibrate when water was located. People would also use dowsing to locate buried treasures, underground minerals. There are lots of different ways to dowse, and various types of equipment can be used. Y-shaped witch hazel twigs are often used, divining rods, which I've already mentioned, and also pendulums can be used. Typically, the pendulum will be a stone on a string or a chain. Really anything that's weighted at the bottom and has the ability to swing can be used in dowsing. And this is what Linda used to dowse. She used a pendulum. In addition to locating, underground water sources or buried treasure or, metals, minerals underground, dowsing is also commonly used in a spiritual way. They believe that dowsing can lead them down the right path that they're supposed to be on in life. And this is how Linda used dowsing, and she completely threw herself into the practice. She attended dowsing seminars, and she started dowsing in order to determine nearly all of her life decisions. From the really big decisions to the most mundane, boring decisions like what to eat, what to read, what to wear, it became her new way of life. The way Linda did this was by creating charts. They looked kind of like pie charts, and each portion of the chart had a different word on it, or phrase, or string of words. And Linda would use a pendulum to determine the answer to whatever question she had. So for instance, if she wanted to know what to wear that day, if she should wear the color blue or red, she would make a dowsing chart, and then she would hold her pendulum over the chart, and it would start to swing. And based on how the pendulum was swinging, that would answer her question.
Life is not as simple as yes and no, black and white. That's why we use dowsing charts. They allow us to get more specific answers for questions which are more complicated than just simple yes or no. When you use pendulum for asking question, you can have answer yes and you can have answer no. And that's basically it. But using a dowsing charts adds different dimension to this. You can check how much something is. So for instance, what's the level of energy? You can check of any numbers. You can check if something is good or positive.
And eventually Linda came to see herself as a master of dowsing, and she started holding seminars of her own where she would teach others how to dowse. And she ended up growing a small following of people who were very dedicated to her teachings. And this is what led Linda to create the nonprofit organization she called the Samaritan Foundation. With Dennis's background in fundraising and nonprofits, he helped to get the foundation off the ground, and he was very supportive of Linda. He was trying to be a good husband and just do whatever he could to support his wife in this new way of life. And Dennis himself started to dowse as well. He was like one of Linda's students. The seminars that Linda was putting on, they would last days at a time. I'm talking like longer than a week sometimes. And at this point, Linda and Dennis are living in Guthrie, Oklahoma in an old 2-story house. And at first, they were conducting the seminars in hotel rooms or sometimes right there in their home. But once more and more people started to show up, they realized that they really needed more space. And so they decided to purchase an abandoned building that just happened to be right across the street from Linda and Dennis's home. And this wasn't just any ordinary building. This was an old abandoned jailhouse. It's called the First Territorial Jail, and it was built way back in 1892. It was the first federal prison in the area, and this prison became well known for being a pretty horrible place. It was large enough to house 90 inmates, and the basement was used as a solitary confinement space. Because the building wasn't properly insulated during the construction, the winters were absolutely brutal for the inmates. It was cold and damp, just a terrible, miserable place to be. and the summers were brutally hot, so this was not an adequate place. It housed some of the worst criminals in the area, and it gained a reputation for being escape-proof. At least that's what the officials claimed, but it was in fact not escape-proof. Several prisoners were able to escape over the years. In fact, in 1896, the leader of an outlaw gang named Bill Doolin, along with a few other prisoners, managed to overpower the guards, and a prison riot broke out. The inmates took control of the prison, they forced the guards to open the other jail cells and let out the other inmates, and then the inmates threw the guards into the cells and they were locked inside. A total of 14 men out of the 50 that were being housed at the time ended up walking out of the prison that night, but the rest of the inmates remained, and one even sent word for help. And Bill Doolin was pretty quickly tracked down and killed by authorities. I'm not sure what happened with the other 13. Another notable incident that took place in the first territorial jail was the sudden and mysterious death of an inmate named James Phillips. James was convicted of murder and he was sentenced to death by hanging. And the story goes, James saw the gallows being built in the lot across the street from his window from his prison cell, and just the sight of seeing the gallows caused him to die of fright. And legend has it that James Phillips' ghost still haunts the old prison. They ended up shutting down the jailhouse in the early 1900s, and it eventually became a Nazarene church, but it was later abandoned in the 70s. And all of that backstory to say this building has some dark history even before the cult moved in. And the building remained empty until Linda Green purchased it in the 90s. And this is really when Linda's hold over the group became even stronger. Linda started telling her students that she could cure illnesses using dowsing. And remember that because it does come back up in the weirdest, creepiest way later in the case. Linda's students were starting to view her as a spiritual leader. She was no longer just their teacher. They thought Linda had mystical powers and she could guide them down the path that they were supposed to be on. You know, they thought that she had all the answers. Some of her students eventually quit their jobs, packed up, and moved to Guthrie, Oklahoma just to be with Linda full time. She never had a huge following. She claimed that she had like 350 members worldwide, but only about 40 of those members ended up moving to Guthrie, and they were living right there in the prison. The prison was turned essentially into a type of compound. They had converted the jail cells into like little bedrooms, and that's where they were sleeping. There were about 40 people living in the monastery at its peak, like I said, and that included 14 children. Linda would conduct daily dowsing sessions with her followers. There were days when they would douse for hours and hours in one sitting.
Key to becoming a strong and healthy person is to understand how to detect disharmony and understand how to remove disharmony.
And she would also give these really passionate sermons. And it's around this time that Linda's teachings turned a little more dark and ominous. First of all, she declared that the world was facing a coming apocalypse. And in order to combat the coming apocalypse, they needed to douse as much as humanly possible.
Unless mankind gets busy with methods such as these, then the planet will not survive another 20 years or so.
She said that constant dowsing would keep the world from falling into total chaos, and it would also help them to defeat the supernatural entities. She also said that everyone needed to devote themselves to her 100% in order to save the world. So you can see this downward spiral that I mentioned earlier, and now she's got 40 people living with her in this monastery, hanging on her every word and ready to do whatever Linda told them to do. Now, at this point, the people in Guthrie didn't know that there was a cult living in the old territorial jailhouse. They probably knew that something weird was going on, but Linda was pretty secretive about what was happening within the Samaritan Foundation. But word of the cult would spread within certain circles, and new members would trickle in, and they would sit in on the dowsing seminars. A woman named Flanagan McKenzie heard about the Samaritan Foundation and this amazing woman named Linda Green who could heal sicknesses using dowsing, and she was instantly intrigued. And in 1992, Flanagan attended a week-long seminar, and that was it. She was in. She really connected with Linda and the other members and just their belief system, and she knew that this was something that she really wanted to be a part of. And she was very excited to share what she had learned with one of her friends. This friend was actually more than just a friend. He and Flanagan had actually dated for several years, but they had broken up the previous year. This was a very peaceful split. They still really cared for one another, and so even though they were no longer romantically involved, they still remained extremely close. And this friend's name was Alan Ross, and Alan is a very, very significant part of this case. Alan Ross was born on March 26, 1953, and he grew up in Naperville, Illinois. Alan was actually a twin. He had a twin brother named Brad, and he had one other brother who was older than he and Brad. His father's name was Lori Ross, and he was a chemist, and his mother's name was Anne, and she was a social worker. Alan seemed to have a pretty normal, uneventful childhood, but he was always seen as a little different than the other kids. He was more of a free thinker. He was described as eccentric. He didn't go with the masses. He was his own person, and this made him kind of a loner. He became very interested in film as he grew into his teenage teenage years, he got a camera and he would just record everything wherever he went. Because Alan was different than his brothers, it made it a little bit harder for him to talk to his father in particular. His father, Laurie, was more conservative, more traditional, and so their ability to communicate with each other wasn't the best. They just had such different personalities. But Alan was very close with his mother, Anne. They had a very tight bond. She was always very supportive of Alan, and she became like his rock to lean on growing up. So when Alan decided to pursue a career in filmmaking, his mother was very encouraging. He started taking film classes his senior year of high school, and he loved it so much he knew that this was what he wanted to dedicate his life to. He attended the School of the Art Institute, and he took film courses just to further his knowledge, and Alan absolutely flourished in this environment. He had finally found his people. He was described as an eccentric among eccentrics, and he made so many new friends in this new chapter in his life. He eventually moved to Chicago, and he threw himself into the film scene there, and he found his niche in experimental documentaries. His first documentary was called The Grandfather Trilogy. It was 3 parts, and it followed the final months of his grandfather's life. Alan helped to establish the Chicago Filmmakers, which is a not-for-profit organization designed to support those in the film industry, and he also worked as an editor for the Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom. Now, none of these jobs paid very well, and in between working on films, Alan would drive a taxi cab just to make some extra money. But even though Alan didn't have all the money in the world and he was pretty much living paycheck to paycheck, he finally felt like he was where he belonged and he was thriving. But his life took a turn in 1986 when his mother Anne passed away after a battle with cancer. This completely devastated Alan, of course. Like I said, he and Anne were very close, and when he lost her, he just didn't really know what to do. He started searching for a purpose in life. He started traveling more, and it was also after the death of his mother that Alan became more interested in his spirituality, and he became particularly interested in the occult. He also got very interested in UFOs and the supernatural, but no matter what Alan did or what new thing he threw himself into, he never felt like he had any answers. He was just desperately searching for something, and when his ex-girlfriend Flanagan McKenzie told him about Linda Green's Samaritan Foundation, he was very interested. He thought that maybe this person could have some answers for him. And so in 1992, Alan made the long drive from Chicago to Guthrie, Oklahoma to sit in on one of Linda's seminars. And during this initial lesson, Linda spoke about how to handle the grief of losing a loved one by, quote, tapping into your own subconscious. And she claimed by doing this, you could keep the darkness out. Alan thought that this was the answer that he had been searching for ever since his mother passed away. And after that very first meeting, Alan was completely hooked in. But this was just the beginning of the end for Alan, and getting involved with Linda would have devastating consequences because Linda was becoming more and more unhinged as the months went on. Now, it comes out later in the case that Linda did have some form of mental health issue, which we'll talk about later. And this was obviously manifesting around this time, and Linda was just progressively getting worse and worse. And I wanted to mention that now because the things we're about to talk about do not make any sense. I am just going to basically regurgitate what I've read because I don't understand any of this. I can't even begin to break it down myself and explain it to you. This is probably the first time that I've researched a cult and I've come out of it just as confused as when I started. Linda was preaching some very extremely off the wall stuff. First of all, Linda started referring to herself as God. Now, this part I actually do understand. This is nothing new. This is textbook cult leader. But Linda said that she was God because she had given up her life in order to save others. And I don't know if she means that literally or figuratively. Not really sure what she means by that. She also believed that barcodes were evil, and in order to combat that evil, you needed to draw a circle and then place the object with the barcode inside of the circle. This was supposed to sort of contain the evil energy, okay? And this next part is one that I'm just gonna have to read verbatim because I can't even begin to explain what the hell it means. It's wild. Linda said that vampires were real and they could steal your soul through telephones, and so using telephones was a very risky situation. The cult members definitely still did use phones on occasion, but Linda was terrified that the vampires would get her through the phones. She also said, quote, a vampire could transfer a vampire seed to your vestigial tail through the vehicle of sexual prana. No clue what that means. And she said that one effective way to eliminate what Linda referred to as spiritual waste was by propelling such waste into celebrities because many movie stars are zombies without souls who feel nothing from the procedure. Linda claimed that actress Rosanna Arquette was a Ray Octave zombie. Madonna was a Nephilim zombie. This is likely a reference to the beings that are written about in the Bible, the mysterious beings that were said to be large in size and strength. She also said that Bill Clinton was an animal mutant zombie, Hillary Clinton was a 3 virtue zombie, and Saddam Hussein was a 5 virtue zombie. Linda said that you can eliminate unwanted or negative energy by sending it through these zombie celebrities. But she said if you didn't have any zombie celebrities just hanging around, you could send stray obsessive energy into soy milk and then pour it down the sink. She said, quote, "It's amazing how many spiritual energies can be directed into soy milk and poured down the sink." Linda went on to write at least 3 books detailing her beliefs, and within these books, there were several dowsing charts. And I did try to get a copy of these books for my research, but they were like $300. So instead, here is some footage of some of the pages from the books. The words on some of the dowsing charts make absolutely no sense. If the point of the charts was for spiritual guidance, how does any of this make sense? Like, how was this guiding anyone? Linda advised her followers to be dowsing 24/7, basically, for every single decision. And so if they ever had to travel, she told them to take smaller travel-sized dowsing charts with them. And so they can just continue to dowse, using their pendulums to decide every single decision, even when they were on the go. There was one occasion where Alan was staying with a friend, and this friend ended up finding one of Alan's dowsing charts in her house. And she was alarmed and creeped out, to say the least.
It was, it looked like it was Xeroxed charts it looked like a Ouija board, pie things. And I looked at that, and I looked at it closely, and it was hard to read because it was so small. It was clearly made like as a traveling card. It wasn't a real one. That's when I really knew that this thing was really weird. Obsessions, homosexual, sloth, greed, lying, thieving, hate woman, mucus, vagina spasm, clamp, liquid, lesbian, hoe, satanic ritual, magic blood substance, egg pockets.
Linda also outlined what you should do if you ever needed to remove a vampire from your home. I'm going to put this on the screen. I'm not going to read the whole thing. I just want to touch on some bullet points here because this is absolutely insane. So Linda says the vampires may have many vampire shadows. The vampire is the tree. The shadows are the roots. And if you destroy the roots, the tree will fall. You may have 3 primary vampires, but 7 shadows from those vampires. She says to line them all up and handle them all at the same time. So you can destroy them in several ways. We can see 9 of them here. You can destroy them by chopping off their vestigial tail and then chopping it into pieces, pureeing it, and then throw it into sulfuric acid. You could also slit the jugular, then drain the blood into a pit, or you could cut out heart and lungs and then chop and pull out the heart thread and then throw it all into a pit. She says you can cut out the pelvic chakra, remove both male and female centers, snap spine, and then pull the pelvis thread. Or you could blast the top of the head with fire, chop the rest of the head, and put it into the sulfuric acid pit. Pretty wild stuff. She would also talk extensively about demonic possessions and UFOs and alien abductions. Linda was obviously mentally unwell at this point, like I said, and she was just gradually becoming more and more disconnected to reality as the days went on. And her followers had been mostly successful, well-adjusted people, like lawyers, doctors, or architects that were in Linda's group. And I think that this cult was probably an example of a cult of personality where the cult leader hooks and pulls in their followers mostly just by being super likable and charismatic and charming and confident. And so the followers became enamored with Linda herself. And so when she started taking the foundation down this dark, weird path with talks of zombies and vampires and stuff, they believed what she was saying because they were already committed to following her as a person. So like I said, Alan was completely captivated by Linda and the Samaritan Foundation, and he became a regular at the seminars. He would make the 800-mile journey from Chicago to Guthrie as often as he could. And during one of these visits, Linda made a very important announcement. All of the members of the cult would be paired up and married, and it didn't matter if they knew each other or not. They could have literally just met that day. I'm assuming that Linda was dowsing in order to determine who married who, and she conducted the ceremonies herself. Alan ended up being married off to a woman named Jill or Jennifer. I've seen both names in the research, but I'm just going to say Jennifer. And he'd only known her for 3 days. And when Alan returned home from his weekend visit to Guthrie, he announced to all of his friends and coworkers that he had just married some random woman who he barely knew. And they were, of course, completely shocked. But Alan seemed really happy about the situation. In fact, he seemed happier than anyone had seen him in years. And by the end of 1992, Alan announced that he was moving to Guthrie permanently. And this was what really shocked everyone because Chicago was where Alan had made so many friends and contacts in the film industry. It just didn't make sense for him to up and move 800 miles away. Something was not sitting right with his friends, and this was not the Alan that everyone knew, and so people were worried about him. But he said he was happy, and so they just tried to be as supportive as possible. But not long after Alan moved to Guthrie, his friends started receiving postcards from him with strange messages. One said, "I seized the opportunity to seek answers for questions I had not been able to seek. And the masters will shut you up in a pen with others. Then it will be up to you to find a house to enter." So needless to say, Alan's friends were super confused and super worried about him, and they didn't know if he was like having a mental breakdown or what. So remember earlier how I mentioned that Linda claimed that she could heal the sick? Well, one day Linda announced to her followers that she was terminally ill, and the only way for her to be healed was if Alan and his new wife Jennifer had sex on top of her body while everyone watched. She wanted Alan and Jennifer to literally climb on top of her body and have sex in front of everyone. And they did exactly as they were told, and they got on top of Linda's body and they did it. I've been trying to work out the logistics of that, and I'm really struggling to figure it out. Alan and Jennifer, they finish up, and after it was over, Linda announced that it worked. She was completely cured. And then she decided that she wanted Alan for herself. Now, by this point, Linda had divorced Dennis. They had divorced about a year before this, but they had remained on really good terms, and Dennis was actually still an active member of the cult. In fact, Linda actually married off one of the other cult members to Dennis. So Linda tells Alan and Jennifer that they were done, their marriage was dissolved, and Alan would now belong to her. I'm not sure if Jennifer ended up leaving the group or not, but I think that Linda kicked her out. So Alan and Linda are now married, and Alan is sort of helping to run the cult at this point. Linda is still the head of the operation, of course, but Alan is like an assistant cult leader. At this point, the people of Guthrie still did not know that there was a cult operating in their town, but that was all about to change. In 1993, a woman named Nellie George joined the Samaritan Foundation. Nellie was from Massachusetts, and she was a young mother of 2 kids. A friend had given Nellie some literature about Linda and the Samaritan Foundation, and she really took to it right away. And Nellie's husband, John George, started noticing some very odd behaviors not long after she received that literature. Nellie started dowsing. She also started drawing circles and putting groceries in the circles because of the evil barcodes. He also caught her drawing circles under her children's pillows. He also saw her drawing pentagrams and then putting objects within the pentagrams. And then one day, Nellie told John that she was going to Oklahoma to attend one of Linda's seminars, and she would be gone for 5 days, and she was taking the kids with her. John, understandably, was not happy about this. He didn't want Nellie to go to the seminar because he was already feeling weird about this foundation, and he definitely didn't want his children going. But in the end, Nellie was able to convince John that everything was fine and she and the kids would be back after 5 days. And so John reluctantly agreed. But after Nellie and the kids left, John realized that all of the children's clothes were gone. Nellie had taken all of their clothes with her on what was supposed to be a 5-day trip. And so major alarm bells are starting to go off. Now, this was the early 90s. Nellie did not have a cell phone, so John had no way of calling her up and asking her what the hell was going on. And he also didn't have a number to call the foundation. And so John just had to wait until Nellie called him, but she never did. And when 5 days came and went, John knew that something was very, very wrong. He managed to track down a phone number for Linda Green, and when he finally got a hold of Nellie, she told him that she and the kids were not coming home. And this marked the beginning of a pretty ugly and very public custody battle over the kids. Nellie thought that the kids should stay with her because she was the mother, but John was understandably worried about his kids' well-being because they were literally living in an abandoned jailhouse with a cult. So John was seeking full custody of the kids because he had reason to believe that they were not in a safe environment. And he ended up turning over some of Linda's writings that Nellie had left behind in their home. And included in those writings was the stuff about disposing of vampires. You know, the one about cutting out their hearts and lungs and pulling out their eye threads and putting them in sulfuric acid. So it wasn't looking good for Nellie, and John was granted full custody. And this very public custody battle is what ultimately brought the cult to light. Word had spread all over Guthrie about this epic court battle over these 2 kids whose mother had joined a quasi-religious sect right there in their hometown. And everything started to fall apart for Linda because not long after everyone found out that she was running a cult in town, another major news story broke. In 1995, a bomb went off at the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City.
In the TV9 newsroom, if you are anywhere downtown, you probably heard it and felt it. An explosion of some kind downtown Oklahoma City. Take a look at this picture. This is our tower cam shot. A plume of smoke rising in the air.
A man named Timothy McVeigh had detonated a bomb inside of a Ryder truck that was parked outside of the building, killing 168 people and injuring more than 800. This, of course, became known as the Oklahoma City bombing, and this event has gone down in history as the single worst act of domestic terrorism in American history. During the investigation into the bombing, a tip came in that a Ryder truck, very similar to the one that had contained the bomb, had at one time been seen parked outside of the old territorial jail. And since police in Guthrie were now very aware that there was a cult operating inside of the jailhouse, they thought that there might be a chance that Linda and her followers could be connected to the bombing in some way. And so several members of the cult, including Alan and Linda, were questioned, but it was proven that that Ryder truck was still very much intact, and so it was obviously not the one that was involved in the bombing. And no other connection was ever found between the cult and the bombing, and so they were eventually cleared. But this whole situation with the custody battle and the bombing, it shook Linda, and she did not like all of this unwanted attention on her in the foundation. She was becoming more and more paranoid by the day, and this prompted some of the members to leave the cult. And by the end of 1995, Linda announced that they were moving out of the monastery. She said that all but 3 of her followers needed to find somewhere else to live, while she and the other 3 relocated to Cheyenne, Wyoming. These 3 people were her husband Alan Ross, her ex-husband Dennis Green, and a woman named Julia Williams. Julia was like Linda's best friend and her most loyal follower. So Linda, Alan, Julia, and Dennis all moved into a house together in Cheyenne, Wyoming. This is when things take a horrific turn. After the move to Wyoming, Linda's mental health was steadily declining. The paranoia, the delusions, the outlandish beliefs, it was all, just continuing to get worse. And cult numbers were dwindling down to an all-time low. People were starting to see a side of Linda that they hadn't seen before. She was no longer the cheerful, charismatic, charming leader that they had known. She was becoming this really on edge, super paranoid person. And so Linda was losing members left and right. Even Dennis eventually moved out of the Wyoming house and he moved to Colorado, leaving just Linda, Alan, and Julia in the house in Wyoming. And it's thought that Alan was also starting to have doubts about Linda in the foundation. In the fall of 1985, Alan was contacted by his good friend and colleague, Christian Bauer, about working on a documentary together about the Mississippi River. Alan accepted the job, and Linda was not happy about this. She thought that Alan spent too much time working and not enough time with her in the foundation, which was just objectively not true. He did still work on films, but the vast majority of his time was spent at Linda's side. The filming for this documentary would require Christian and Alan to travel across several different states. And over the course of the 6 weeks of the filming of the documentary, Linda would just randomly pop up unannounced. She showed up once while they were filming in St. Louis. She stayed for a bit and then she left. And then she showed up a second time when the filming was wrapping up in New Orleans. And Alan did not seem happy to see Linda. According to Christian, he seemed annoyed and almost embarrassed of her. You can see in this footage that Alan pans away from Linda as she's like dancing and trying to be flirty with him. She's like jumping in front of the camera and trying to be sexy, I guess, and Alan just slowly pans away from her. Christian will later say that Alan and Linda argued a lot on that trip and Alan just seemed completely fed up. Christian and Alan had made plans to have one last dinner before Alan returned to Wyoming, but Linda got upset and they started fighting again. Alan told Christian that he would see him at the restaurant, but he never showed up. The next morning, Christian saw him one last time as they were collecting their equipment. They said one final goodbye, and that was the last time Christian ever saw Alan. Just a few weeks later, Alan vanished without a trace. No one had heard from Alan in weeks, and Thanksgiving came and went, and then Christmas, and still no word from Alan, and his family was becoming very, very worried. It was completely out of character for him not to call or write or visit during the holidays. Alan's family did do what they could to track him down. They would call and write, but there was no response. And then one day, the police back in Guthrie, Oklahoma started receiving these strange messages through their fax machine. Linda Green was sending them loads of faxes claiming that Alan Ross was dead and he had been killed by her ex-husband, Dennis Green. Now, at this point, the police in Guthrie hadn't seen Alan Ross in months, since they had questioned him about the Oklahoma City bombing. And as far as they knew, he wasn't dead or even missing. But they did end up talking to Dennis Green about this bizarre fax. Like I said, at this point, Dennis had finally put some distance between himself and Linda and the cult, and he was now living in Colorado. Dennis said that the last time he had seen Alan was in October of 1995, so just about a month before Alan disappeared. He said Alan drove to Colorado to his house to pick up Linda's son, and while he was there, he and Dennis had a long conversation. I haven't mentioned this really, but Dennis and Alan seemed to get along really great. There was no issue between the two of them, at least not that anyone knew of. And so Alan felt comfortable telling Dennis that he was planning to move. And he even asked Dennis Dennis for advice on what type of vehicle he should buy to haul his stuff. The guys had a good rest of their visit. Alan helped Dennis work on his truck, and then he left and he headed back home to Wyoming. And Dennis claimed that that was the last time he ever saw Alan. But he said about a month after that, Linda randomly showed up at his house and she had a crazy story to tell. According to Linda, she and Alan had been having these really insane fights and she was afraid of him, and so she, quote, did something to him that would ensure that he would no longer be able to hurt her. She said that she murdered Alan and then buried his body in the crawl space in the basement of the house in Cheyenne, Wyoming. But remember, Linda had gone completely off the rails by this point. She was more delusional than ever. She had started sending these crazy faxes to random places all over the country about aliens and zombies and stuff. So Dennis knew that Linda's grip on reality was hanging on by a thread, and so when she made that claim, he didn't really know if he could believe it. But after several weeks of not hearing from Alan, Dennis started to wonder if this could actually be true and Alan really was dead. So Dennis actually ended up reporting all of this to the police. This is before the police in Guthrie even came to question him. He called the police in Cheyenne. Dennis told the Cheyenne police everything that Linda had said about killing Alan and burying him in the crawl space in the basement. And so the police did go to that house in Wyoming and they checked out the basement, but they found nothing. And that was basically the end of their investigation for a while. The case pretty much went cold after this, and for the next 4 years, Alan remained a missing person. Meanwhile, Linda had been placed in a psychiatric hospital for a bit, not long after Alan disappeared. She was officially diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, and she was treated, and eventually she was released. She and her best friend, and still very much devoted follower of Julia Williams, started just moving all around the United States, using fake names and never staying in one place for too long. But something happened in 1999 that would reignite the interest in Alan's case. Alan's friends in the film community decided to create a documentary centered around them searching for Alan. The documentary was called Missing Alan, and you can actually watch it here on YouTube. I've been including clips of it here in my video, but I will leave a link in the description box. During the production of this documentary, Alan's friend Christian Bauer travels between various states, conducting interviews and searching for any trace of Alan.
I had been missing him for 4 years, and there was no way that there was going to be an official investigation. The case was closed, more or less. The only way to find out something about him, about his disappearance, about his fate, was to mount this documentary and to start looking for him with the camera.
And during the filming, he and his crew actually did uncover some major evidence. They found Alan's camera, the thing that he always had with him wherever he went, no matter what. This was not a good sign. They knew that Alan would never have voluntarily left this camera behind. Up to that point, they were trying to remain positive that Alan had just moved away somewhere and he didn't want to be found. That wasn't a far-fetched idea. Knowing that he wanted out of this relationship with Linda and knowing what a free spirit Alan was, his friends thought that that could actually be a real possibility. But when they found his camera, they pretty much knew that this was not going to end well. Before the filming wrapped up, Alan's twin brother Brad made one last desperate plea for the Cheyenne Police Department to go back to the house and check the basement one more time. The police did agree to go back and search, but they said if they didn't find anything this time, that was it. The case was closed until more solid evidence was presented. And it was during this final search of the basement that they noticed something that they hadn't during the first search. They noticed a small area of the basement floor had a layer of cement that didn't match the rest of the cement. It looked newer than the rest of the basement floor. And when they got closer, they could see something sticking out of the ground. It was a part of a Converse shoe, the same type of shoe that Alan was very well known to wear every single day. So police started to break up the floor of the basement, and they discovered a human leg was sticking out of that Converse shoe. After 4 long years of wondering and searching, they had finally found Alan Ross. An autopsy revealed that Alan had been shot in the head with a 9mm handgun, and the bullet had entered through the left side of his head and then exited out the lower right. His body was partially mummified, but the most bizarre finding was that Alan's genitals were completely missing. Someone had cut off Alan's genitals, and if you remember back to Linda's writings on how to get rid of a vampire, she mentioned removing the genitals. It's believed that on or around November 22nd, 1995, Linda and Alan got into a massive argument when Linda found out that Alan was planning to leave. Linda shot Alan in the head, then ritualistically removed his genitals, which were never located, by the way. She then buried him in the basement of the home and covered the area with cement. Now, this was the theory, but they still didn't know for sure how this all went down and who was responsible. And Christian and his crew actually managed to track down Linda.
My innards were rotten, my lips were burned off. I couldn't speak. I will tell the camera the truth. My sorrow is so great. I cannot measure the sorrow. Alan was murdered by Dennis Green.
But unfortunately, Linda died before anyone figured out exactly what happened. She passed away in 2002 from liver failure, but she had continued to repeatedly claim that Dennis Green had killed Alan. But then she would say, no, it wasn't Dennis, it was like a special agent that killed him. She was just constantly contradicting herself.
Well, you'll be looking a long time for him. It's not pretty, Christian.
I also read a fax by you saying that Dennis, your ex-husband, had killed Alan.
No, he buried him.
He buried him.
Yes,
So who killed him then?
the specialist.
But after she died, her best friend, Julia Williams, came forward with a story of her own. She told police that Dennis Green had killed Alan and then he forced her to help him bury the body and clean up the crime scene. However, what little evidence they did have actually pointed at Linda being the killer and not Dennis. According to Linda and Dennis's son, his mom always carried a 9mm in her purse, the same type of gun that was used in the murder. And Dennis just didn't seem to have a motive. If you believe his story that he and Alan got along great and there was no jealousy between the two of them, it just doesn't make sense. Also, the police didn't feel like they could trust Julia because she was constantly changing her story. And also, she had worshipped Linda. You know, she had been her best friend and most devoted follower for years, even up to the day that Linda died. So there was a very real possibility that Julia was actually covering for Linda even in death. And she was just continuing Linda's crusade to blame everything on Dennis. And even though Linda was dead by this point and they couldn't bring her to justice, they could press charges against Julia for helping to dispose of a body and clean up the crime scene. She had confessed to doing those things. The case ended up going to trial in 2004, and during the trial, the prosecution pushed the idea that Linda was the killer and Julia had helped her to clean up and conceal the murder. During the trial, Dennis got up on the stand and he told his side.
She accused me by a fax and by a phone call of killing Alan, which was horrifying to me, scary. And at that point, that's when I began to think, well, perhaps Alan didn't run away, perhaps they killed him. And that was a horrifying feeling.
And Dennis and Linda's son Daniel also took the stand, and he implicated his mother in the murder.
Behind a rock, and she blew the lock off. It freaked me out, you know, but she got the lock off.
Do you know what kind of gun it was?
It was a 9mm, I remember that.
In the end, Julia was found guilty and she was sentenced to a minimum sentence of 24 months and she had to pay a small fine. Dennis Green was never charged and the case is considered closed at this point. Alan's father, Lori, died just a few months after Alan's remains were discovered, and a joint memorial service was held for Lori and Alan in October of 2000. Now, before I end this video, I want to mention one more bizarre death connected to this cult. In 1996, one of the few followers Linda had left was a woman named Donna Hebb. And for some reason, Linda kicked Donna out of the cult. And right after she was kicked out, she deliberately stepped in front of an oncoming train and she was killed instantly. Witnesses claim that Donna was standing on the tracks holding a small dog and smiling when the train hit her. And that is all I have on this case. Please let me know what you think about this one down in the comments. Don't forget to click the link in the description box or go to drinktrade.com/summer if you want to surprise a loved one with a trade subscription this holiday season. If you found this video interesting, please consider subscribing, liking this video, and leaving me a comment. That is the easiest way for you to support me and my channel. And as always, I appreciate each and every one of you for watching, and I will see you next time.